Do you have any thoughts or concerns with obviously the US is beginning to open up. Texas is pretty much opening up everything. Um, there are several different regions around the country that are creating leagues that's just more efficient for the people that are within driving distance to play softball. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
any thoughts or concerns um, with the launch of that? Or I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah. At face value, yeah, like of course I'm concerned. Um, so I'm concerned because there are several, there are a kind of a soup of pressures trying to influence folks to make that decision, right? Like there's an economic pressure, there's kind of a social pressure, there's like medical kind of pushback pressure, there's political pressure. So, I think like what goes into moving uh, a, a region from a phase one, which is stay-at-home orders, to phase two, which is where you can have more non-essential services open up, to phase three, where I'll just share the restart plan here. This is our restart plan here in BC. So phase one is like essential services operating during COVID-19. So that would be like all the stuff that's been open when your region's been closed.
Mm-hmm.
Phase two, we're going into that today, still asking people to stay close to home and avoid travel between communities, but like massage therapy and physical therapy, restaurants can open with sufficient distancing measures, recreation and sports can begin to open with physical distancing measures and rule modifications. And then kind of phase three is people traveling throughout British Columbia or throughout their state, schools reopening. And then phase four is like, this is following wide vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your question, like, how do I feel about states reopening? Well, so this is the US Olympic Committee response to COVID-19. This is Dr. John Finoff's slide. He's actually a physiatrist and the head team doc for Tokyo 2020. And so phases one and two, like phase one, stay-at-home orders, training facilities are closed, you're training on your own with your own equipment and likely doing some virtual coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Phase two isn't really when they're talking about reopening sport. The USOC was proposing that perhaps we should wait till phase three. And I know every state or region kind of defines the phases a little bit differently, but like essentially in my mind, when physical therapy opens, then we can start talking about sport, right? So if physical
Right.
therapy is open in your region, then we can start talking about opening training facilities and doing some smaller group training.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually really like down on discouraged, like I don't know when we'll see sport reopen until this webinar. And on this panel, there was an epidemiologist from the CDC, and then Lauren Sauer is from the emergency, event preparedness and emergency response group at Johns Hopkins. And there was a question and answer period of this webinar, and that was one of the questions, like, do you think sport will reopen at a local level first or an international level first? And all of them said local level first, because you can start to develop a little social bubble, so your team becomes an expansion of your social bubble. The 2 or 3 teams that you play against is also, just widens your bubble a little bit more, but that bubble's like really contained. As soon as you're going into another county or across state lines, or like flying, from Florida to California, then that social bubble becomes like enormous and kind of and out of control in terms of like knowing positive cases or high risk exposures. So they were optimistic that we could return to sport at a local level before, returning to sport at a national or international level, because we're going to create these little cohorts, of a social sport bubble. For example, these little cohorts that have the same infection control procedures, likely have the same testing center. If there's a positive case, then there can be contact tracing back to that individual and others can be notified. So I'm actually optimistic that type of approach in states that look more like this in terms of cases. So this is a graph that's like cumulative diagnosed COVID-19 case rates by selected countries. So this is just off that BC Restart website that I showed you. And in BC, we're really proud of the fact that we've been able to keep cases quite low. We had very aggressive and early social distancing here. So our case burden is much lower than the rest of Canada and much lower than the rest of the world. But within each of these countries, there are regions, if this is Canada and this is the province I live in, I'm sure there are states that like this is the USA and this is the state I live in. So some of the conditions for kind of reopening on a public health level are that, the rate of new cases is slowing, that there's widespread testing and contact tracing, and that, with this reopening, that there isn't a large spike in cases. So I'm sure there are many counties around the United States that meet that criteria. And so, kind of after doing a bit more self-education and understanding kind of the question at hand, I think in some states, it's absolutely reasonable if they're in a phase 2 or phase 3 to consider reopening sport with appropriate physical distancing and safety measures and spectator education and field insurance, to these small cohorts.
Man, a lot of changes.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy. Like, I feel like I'm like kind of an armchair public health officer. Like, one of the things that I had put together as I was thinking about this is like, I am a doctor, but I'm not your doctor. This is not medical advice for softball, and I think every sport administrator, coach, parent, national sport body is going to be challenged by this. It's easy to sit on the sidelines and be like, do this, do that, but actual practice, it's really going to be challenging.
Right. And kind of overnight, we've all kind of become risk managers in how we live and the decisions that we make going forward, which I think it makes it so hard for people to know what's right and what's wrong. And it's just a complicated situation where I think people feel kind of hit over the head with the amount of information and the media flying all around. I think the social bubble that you're talking about is just like a huge piece to like getting momentum in the sense of like being able to eventually kind of move from our local city to a different county. And then once that's stable, then we can move even further. And then once that's stable, then we can move that further. It's not necessarily the rate that people want to hear things move at, but it's what, in terms of managing risk, it seems like a decent plan.